Greetings and welcome to yet another episode of Into Zimbabwe, a weekly production sponsored by the Zimbabwe Human Rights Monitoring Platform. My name is Liam Kaninga and obviously I'm your host. So today we're going to be looking at democracy under arrest, monitoring civil and political rights in Zimbabwe, particularly under COVID-19. We're going to look at the number of abductions and arbitrary arrests that have been done by the regime against activists and opposition leaders since March 2020. Then we're also going to look at the relieving news of Alan Moyes' release after 72 days of incarceration at Harare Remand Prison. He was granted bail worth 10,000 Zimbabwean dollars. Then we're also going to look at Makomborero Aruzivish's arrest and the events that surround the incident itself. News has it that shots were fired at an unarmed citizen. And then also we are going to be discussing and analyzing this topic with the help of Comrade Brother Nqobizitha Mlambo, an emerging public intellectual, a graduate from the University of Zimbabwe, a former student leader, and a social justice advocate, who is also employed in the civil society spaces of Zimbabwe. So please, stay with me.
Hi, you in your pursuit of knowledge in the academic arena, you deserve to do so without fear or favor, let alone any interference or public pressure. Your government has to make available all the resources you need to learn and ensure that you manage to express your thoughts and opinions without cohesion or fear of victimization. Now that's academic freedom. But is this demand true to your case? The Zimbabwe National Students Union, ZINASU, in conjunction with Denmark National Students Union, DSF, present Free to Learn, a weekly series focused on discussing academic freedom as a fundamental right. So I, Liam Kaninga, invite you to participate on the show as I interact with influential figures on the academic arena. Catch the new show every Monday on these platforms.
So welcome back, viewers. And as I said before, today we are joined by Comrade Brother Nqobizitha Mlambo, an emerging public intellectual, a former student leader, and one seasoned employee of the civil society spaces of Zimbabwe. Now, from an intellectual perspective, how do you deduce the situation in Zimbabwe?
Well, thank you so much for the fantastic question. I think the reality, Comrade Liam, is that after there was a military coup in this country on the 17th of November in 2017, that marked the end of constitutionalism in Zimbabwe. Zimbabweans did not know that by sanitizing a coup through getting into the streets of Harare and demonstrating to remove a supposedly constitutionally elected government, we were sowing the seed for authoritarian politics. So some of us are not surprised by the conduct of what they are calling the Second Republic in Zimbabwe. So when you're under the product of a military coup, you must know that when the men in military fatigue rule, they do not rule by the dictates of the constitution. Rather, they rule by the dictates of what they are trained to do in the military barracks. So the challenge we have is that the government that is in Zimbabwe is a product of a military coup. And the history of military coups, I won't go to town on the history of military coups. You and your viewers know that whenever a coup is done, say that there will be another coup or there will be a total annihilation of civil liberties that citizens are entitled to. Is provided for by the constitution. So we are operating within the framework of a republic that is a product of a coup, and to cure that, to solve that, we have to get back to the basis and cure the November 2017 coup through the conducting of a free, fair and credible election. But it cannot be conducted by those who did the coup. We then need what people like Brian Kagono and Tony Riley are talking about, a national transitional authority that can then guarantee, that must be guaranteed by the international community, yes, SADC, the African Union, and the United Nations, and then have a free, fair and credible election so that we come back, or we get back to legitimacy, we get back to constitutionalism, and those in military fatigue stay in military barracks. So it is a given fact that if you look at the situation in Myanmar, for example, the military regime there, after doing a coup, he suspended human rights. He suspended some basic provisions of the Bill of Rights are under the Constitution and so on. So it's also reflected in our own scenario, but it's not only reflected in Zimbabwe, it's also reflected in Kagame's Rwanda. They came after a military operation. It was also reflected under Paul Biya's Cameroon. He has been there for the past 39 years. It's also reflected under Equatorial Guinea's president, Theodora Obiang Nguema Mbasogo. He has been there for the past 40 years. They are products of militarization of state institutions. So to deal with this will not end. The arrest, the arbitrary arrest, the violation of constitutional rights will not end unless and until civilian politics is led and controlled by civilians and military affairs are led and controlled by military men.
Okay, just like what the civil-military relations theory actually prescribes, that the military forces should take a professional distance away from politics, because their collusion with the state might result in them ordaining themselves a political god. And which is something that we have noticed in Zimbabwe, that since March 2020, the army has been more of like a puppet handler behind the scenes. We've seen even the Ministry of Health being taken over by former military personnel. Even the permanent secretary is also a retired major general in the army. So, but then we know that there has to be a non-state actor who plays the role of a watchdog, civil society. What then becomes the role of civil society, especially in policing and monitoring the promotion of human rights under situations of COVID-19 in Zimbabwe?
Thank you so much. I think, firstly, what is civil society? Civil society does not mean organized organizations, or what they call the NGO sector in this country. Civil society are citizens who discover their agents, and citizens discover their agents using the Constitution as a weapon and as a point of entry. So if you understand civil society from the basis that it is citizens organized loosely in social movements or individually discovering their agents, then we can have a conversation around how they can organize within the context of a country that is a product of a coup, or what they are calling the Second Republic. So you also have to understand the operations of the state in the context of COVID-19, the weaponization of COVID-19 as a tool to suppress civil and political liberties. But there is no tool or a strategy that can defeat numbers. So if you don't have numbers, if you are not organized, if you only agonize and you don't organize, for example, then the state will continue to mutilate your civil and political liberties. But it is a difficult context, considering that to organize and to mobilize means violating COVID-19 regulations. So there comes a problem. But thank God for the internet and social media platforms. These can be platforms at least to start the process of political conscientization. I would argue that the solution does not necessarily lie in just coming out into the streets and exercising Section 59 of the Constitution, but rather there are three fundamental areas that we have to look at. Number one, we have to identify the big idea where we can mobilize our citizens, or on which we can mobilize Zimbabwean citizens around. After we identify that particular big idea, for example, the liberation struggle, Gutsa Ruvinji was a big idea that then mobilized people to fight racist Rhodesia. But after identifying the big idea, you have to articulate that particular idea. And that's where the real role as public intellectuals within the space of what you are calling civil society come into play to popularize that particular idea. So it's around articulation of the idea. The third aspect is then the political communication of that particular big idea. So you then need those with the necessary political acumen within civil society. And when I talk about civil society, I'm referring to citizens using the Constitution as a point of entry, the Constitution as a weapon to organize and to resist authoritarianism, to resist tyranny. Not only tyranny in the sense of politics, but the tyranny that they experience in the realms of economics, what we call, or what you students of political science call, political economy. And as much as the politics is tough, the economy is also tough. So civil society, or citizens, let me use the word citizens, should organize not only from a politics point of view, but from a political economy point of view. That if we organize around civil and political rights, let us also not neglect social and economic rights, like your access to food, your right to water, your right to education, even within the midst of this pandemic that we call COVID.
Okay, yeah, speaking of mobilizing from a social and economic rights perspective, this is where we even come to Alan and Makomborero's story, right? Where they were seeking what others would call the right to economic emancipation and social security,
Yes.
which translated into social justice.
Yes.
The arrest of Makomborero and Alan. How do we best present it, or how do we best view it now in the space of fighting to protect this shrinking democratic space in Zimbabwe? How do we then analyze it, its positionary factor within the discourse?
No, I think these two arrests are just reflective of how the state responds to dissent, as I indicated earlier on. But these particular individuals should not be, the analysis of their arrest should not be analyzed within the individuals themselves, but within the context of the broader struggles that they are fighting for. When Alan Moy, I saw a video where he was speaking at Copacabana bus terminus around the socio-economic issues that are affecting the ordinary men and women in Zimbabwe. You look at Makombora Ruzivishe, the arrest, and if you read his charge sheet, you see those particular issues that he was articulating at Impala Car Rentals, for example, those issues that he has been articulating in various protests that he has been involved in, if there are any, they are a clear reflection of the deteriorating socio-economic political question in our own country. So the issues should be beyond the individual. And yes, individuals play a role within the context of a struggle, but this should be the rallying point, or the rallying ideas around social and economic transformation, which is anchored on things like freedom, justice, and solidarity, anchored on a people-centered economy. Suppose they are talking about, we want jobs, for example. They are talking about issues to do with access to public health care that is state-funded. What they are talking about are provisions of the Constitution. So what they are doing is to call upon the state to honor its obligations and uphold, respect, and defend the Constitution. But it becomes difficult to ask those who are products of a coup to follow constitutionalism, because a coup itself is not part and parcel of the Constitution. The Constitution provides for ways and means that a government is supposed to be changed, or a regime is supposed to be changed. It's through free, fair, and credible elections as provided for in the supreme law of the land. But as I said earlier on, when I started my responses to your questions, that we are witnessing the products of a coup, and for us to deal with this permanently, we need a national transitional authority that can see Zimbabwe through a transition to free, fair, democratic, and plural elections. If that does not happen, forget 2023, forget 2028, because the operating environment are seeds or fruits of a military coup.
You spoke of transiting from the individual to the broader collective. Then the collective does not only involve civic organizations or citizens themselves, but there's also a line of assembly, which is political parties. In this particular context, we're speaking of opposition political parties, their role that they should play. And we are also monitoring that, as you said, the right to freedom of assembly itself has become a privilege in Zimbabwe. So how then do oppositions now coalesce around curing the political discourse of Zimbabwe, especially that we are dealing with a government that is born of a coup? So how do opposition then come in and play their role?
Fantastic. I think the opposition, like civil society and like citizens, finds itself also in a very difficult situation. You look at, as I said, when there's a coup, the constitution basically is not recognized. So you look at, for example, the recall of elected members of parliament and elected local authority leaders by a faction of the opposition itself. That alone should tell you that the opposition also organized broadly as a mass alliance, not just as a political party, because I don't think we're at a stage where we have to relegate our social and economic justice aspirations to the opposition in this country. No, it won't work, because understanding the challenges in our country from the prism of a political party is wrong, because the opposition itself is on its knees as we speak. Rather, the opposition should be part and parcel of a broader alliance to challenge what we have seen as the fruits of a military coup. In this broader alliance, some have been calling for a national convergence platform. Remember, in 2006, 2007, there was what they called the People's Charter. The People's Charter was not a product of the MDC, as it was known then. No, the People's Charter was a product of civil society, the MDC, churches, peasants, smallholder farmers, collective academics, intellectuals, to mention but a few. So now requires another convergence, like in 1999, the National Working People's Convention. We need a second National Working People's Convention, albeit within the context of a COVID-19 pandemic, which seems not to be ending anytime soon. So how do we rope in ICTs? Number two, the social base has changed. In 2000, when the opposition was formed, it was formed by workers because the trade union movement then had a base of workers. But now the political economy base, there have been fundamental movements within the political economy of Zimbabwe. We now have small-scale miners, makorokozas. We now have dealers in this economy. We now have an informal economy, or an economy whose share of GDP, I think 13% of this economy's GDP is characterized by the informal economy. How do you organize those people to be part and parcel of that particular alliance? We have unemployed youth and a techno-savvy generation. So where do we rope in ICTs and social media to organize a mass alliance to resist authoritarianism, to resist dictatorship, whatever the adjectives that we might use to describe our situation? This cannot be relegated to the opposition alone. In fact, the opposition itself should rethink its strategies around organizing, basic organizing, a database, for example, of its membership. Where are its structures, for example? That's what the opposition should be worried about. And then social movements worry about mobilizing the people around the three pillars that I talk about, that I spoke of earlier on: the big idea, the articulation of that idea, and the political communication of that particular idea.
Okay, so literally what the context or the picture you're trying to draw here is that which is similar to what happened in South Africa up to the period of 1994, whereby the ANC, the trade union, the students movement, at that time there was AZASCO, like Azania Students Organization, like they went back to society, mobilizing, speak and parcel the message in a manner that suits that context, that spectrum of politics, so that at least every generation comes in. Then that also comes back to the issue of our population demographics, that we have a youthful population. I think the people aged to 0 to 35 in our population are approximately 77%. Then those aged 15 to 35 are nearly 67%. So how do we then close what others want to call the lacuna, but that is the gap between the elderly and the youth, given that most of the elderly are found in rural areas where the establishment thrives a lot, be it in elections and even outside elections. And here in urban areas, this is where we have the youth. And there is a discord of interests, because they feel that what they need is just leadership they support, but here we want services, we want material objectives. So how best do we then play that role in terms of closing the gap?
I think it's very simple. It's very simple to understand that a people follow a message.
Yes.
The message should be clear.
Yes.
So for example, when they said Gutsaru Jinji, 1 man, 1 vote, for example,
yes,
that alone could mobilize Zimbabweans and provoke a 14-year-old, a 16-year-old to cross into Mozambique and be trained to liberate this country from Rhodesia. Yes. If they said Mugabe must go, for example, in 1999, that was a message that was so resounding that in 2008, Morgan Tsvangirai defeated Robert Mugabe. So it's about the message, understanding the material conditions at present, that it's not necessarily that the economic, political and social interest of a young person in urban areas and that of a young person in rural areas are different. No, at the end of the day, you would realize that they all want economic opportunities. Yes. They all want to get married, for example. But how can they get married when they are not employed? How can they be employed when the productive sectors of the economy are underperforming or they are non-existent? And how can they be the productive sectors of the economy when there are policies that inhibit the creation of productive sectors of the economy? So the issues around messaging. If the messaging is clear that our agenda is this, and everyone can be able to articulate it, whether they're in Mzokomba, in Njelele, in Lalapanzi, but they can articulate that particular message, then it can rally the people around itself as a message. The challenge we have are different narratives. We don't have a big idea as a generation of young people. If we develop a big idea,
yes,
articulate it and politically communicate it, you would realize that our interests are the same. Unemployment affects a rural youth and an urban youth or a peri-urban youth, for example. Lack of opportunities, lack of education, lack of access to public health care, lack of water. Actually, it is now a scenario of the ruralization of urban areas themselves. So we are no longer different. You cannot break your PA in rural areas that you have electricity because you don't have electricity, for example, in this country. There are erratic energy shortages. You can't break to a young person in rural Malipati that you have economic opportunities, because here in the urban areas you don't have any economic opportunities. You wake up and sit at a bridge and violate COVID-19 regulations and talk about girls and talk about stuff like that. Issues that are not nationalistic in nature, issues that are not meant to mobilize your fellow young people around the cause, because no one has taken the initiative to identify the issue and to politically communicate that particular idea. So it's around the creation of a narrative. ZANU-PF created a narrative around nationalistic land reclamation, for example, and people were mobilized around that in 2000 at the turn of the millennium. What can we use now to mobilize everyone, the young included, so that the political fortunes, the economic fortunes, and the social fortunes of Zimbabwe can change?
So can we measure the futility of Zimbabwe's foreign policy now under COVID-19, given that it's a signatory to the ICCPR, to the African Charter,
People's Rights and
Human
Democracy.
and People's Rights and Democracy, to the Maputo Protocol, as well as to the Universal Declaration of Rights? You know, I think this is where the issue about sanctions actually comes in. That how can we measure the futility now in terms of Alan Moyo's case, Makomborero's case, Joanna's case? How do we measure the futility there of our relations with the international community?
I think you just used the correct word, futile, futility. You, for example, the political image of a country, because now of, thank God for ICT, social media, authoritarian regimes are finding it hard to cover violations of human rights and stuff like that. There are now hashtags, free Makomborero, there was hashtag free Alan Moyo, free Fadzai Maire, free job. So the issue of ICTs has affected authoritarian politics, and that's why they sometimes shut down the internet. But you can't project, they said when they came in after they did the coup, that we are going to re-engage the West in particular and have Zimbabwe join the community of nations and be part and parcel of this global village. But their actions now, because you have to be accountable. If you want to be part and parcel of the community of nations, there are set rules and standards of accountability. So your Universal Declaration of Human Rights, for example, is a standard. Yes. If people have different political views to you who is governing, just respect their views. If your constitution says it respects freedom of thought, freedom of association, freedom of opinion, respect that. The moment you violate those particular rights and seek to re-engage, that becomes a contradiction. And the world is not stupid. The world is not myopic. The world sees things clearly, beyond propaganda, beyond state-sponsored intellectuals, beyond even Western lobby groups that are funded thousands or millions of dollars to try and rebrand the Zimbabwean brand that has been tarnished because of these human rights violations. The simple truth of the matter is, if you want to walk the talk of liberal democracy, practice it. You cannot have democracy without Democrats. So that is the scenario we have in our country, where people preach democracy during the day, but practice authoritarian politics during the night. So the issue is around Zimbabwe has a tainted image. Yes, it is up to each and every citizen to help in the rebranding of this country. But this takes leadership. And those at the helm of governmental authority at Munumutapa building should start by walking the talk. If you say we're open for business, be open for human rights, be open for plurality, be open for democracy, be open for tolerance. If you say you are open for business, also be open about business to your own people. Disclose the contractual agreements that you sign with foreign nationals where you are mortgaging our natural resources, for example. Disclose to the public why you have reversed the indigenization policy as to what you're going to replace it with in terms of community beneficiation, so that our people can benefit. So without values, and if you read chapter 2 of the Zimbabwean constitution, it speaks about the founding values of Zimbabwe. And one of the founding values of this republic is the value of good governance, is the value of honesty, is the value of transparency, is the value of accountability. Where these values are spurred upon, then the brand Zimbabwe itself will be tarnished.
So, Brother Mlambo, as a parting message, what do you recommend be done? Firstly, by the government. Secondly, by the citizens. And lastly, by non-state actors.
First, thank you so much. I think to the government, the message is simple. You are a product of a coup, yes, but if you are genuine about transforming Zimbabwe politically, socially, and economically, as you say in the NDS1, as you say in the upper middle income economy vision that you articulated, just respect the basic tenets that are provided for in the Constitution. This might be a very big ask to those who don't understand what constitutionalism, what democracy is. To citizens, I think we cannot relegate our struggle for social and economic justice to the democratic opposition. We have to organize on our own through social movements and use our social movements as a point of entry to demand for justice, plurality. If you want economic liberalism, then need that be that. If you want a socialist economic system, then you have to debate these things within the forums of public discussions. To non-state actors, and these are your NGOs, your civic organizations, you play an important role in terms of mobilizing citizens, but more importantly, holding the state to account, not only with regards to civil and political rights, around abductions, around arbitrary arrests, around the violations of the Constitution, but also on the economic aspects of life. Because if citizens are to exercise their agents in terms of politics, in terms of public assembly, in terms of voting, they have to eat first, and those are social and economic rights that should be respected and upheld. So non-state actors, your legitimacy is derived from the people. So also they should be transparent around the work they're doing and involve each and every citizen. And more importantly, if we are to succeed from the perspective of non-state actors, civic organizations must stop being atomized. They should be united. Without unity, then their efforts will be very futile. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Comrade Brother Nqobizitha Mlambo. So viewers, this was Nqobizitha Mlambo, an emerging public intellectual, a former student leader, a social and economic justice advocate, as well as a worker in the civic spaces of Zimbabwe, giving his thoughts, ideas, and perspectives over the civil rights situation in Zimbabwe, civil and political rights situation in Zimbabwe, as well as his recommendations as per perspective. This was Into Zimbabwe. My name is Liam Kanenga. Thank you.